Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is part 4 of Cut Into the Murder of Elizabeth Short, also known as the Black Dahlia. And here's the copyright disclaimer. Where we left off in part 3, we looked at the actual body of Elizabeth Short, who was nicknamed Betty or Beth, and she was also known as the moniker the Black Dahlia due to her dramatic dark hair, her dark lipstick, and her penchant for wearing dark fitted suits and wearing a flower in her hair, just like in this picture. Originally, this murder was called the werewolf murder, but that didn't stick, and it didn't last very long because then one of the reporters heard that she was sometimes known as the Black Dahlia, and that nickname stuck. The killing, the savagery of the crime, the posing of the body, it's one of the most horrendous and sadistic public deaths in the history of Los Angeles and in Hollywood. The Black Dahlia was posed to shock the viewer, and frankly, it is still shocking viewers. After the body was found and then identified, the police sent out between the agencies this police bulletin. The police bulletin specified at that time what they believed that she was last wearing at the Biltmore on January 9, 1947. A black suit with no collar, probably a cardigan style, with a white fluffy blouse, black suede high-heeled shoes, nylon stockings, white gloves with a full-length beige coat, carrying a black plastic handbag with 2 handles, and they gave the dimensions of it, and in which she had a black address book. On day 6 of the investigation, an anonymous string-wrapped parcel was mailed to the Los Angeles Examiner, and it says here, the Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers. The parcel was intercepted by a postal clerk who had spotted the parcel and turned it over to the police. The belongings were mailed from Los Angeles, as shown by the postmark, so the killer was still local at that time. Before placing the envelope in the mail, the killer first soaked it in gasoline. This article notes it's a precaution intended to destroy all fingerprints. And this move was regarded as classifying the killer as a person versed in scientific crime detection, as gasoline dissolves the minute quantities of oil with which fingerprints are formed. And essentially what it does is it destroys the fingerprints, or so they thought. The envelope read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." And the contents of the packet provided detectives with so many new leads, they said they didn't even know which leads to check first. Here's a pile of what arrived. So just to recap, you have as evidence the body of Beth. You have the cement bag that was next to Beth. You would have had the tire tracks that weren't recorded for posterity. You would have knowledge of the body that, there was some torture, that the body was exsanguinated, didn't have blood in it, so you're starting to learn that whatever happened needed privacy. And now they're getting a letter from the killer hiding his handwriting and giving actual belongings of Elizabeth Short coming from LA. Accompanying the letter was Elizabeth Short's black address book, social security card, half a dozen snapshots, a baggage claim check, and other articles labeled Dahlia's belongings. The address book is a key piece of evidence, and note the address book is embossed with a man's name, Mark Hansen, who is later going to be a suspect. And the address book held the names of at least 75 acquaintances who then had to be found and questioned and ruled out. At least one page was ripped out of the address book, which could lead one to imply that it held the name of the killer, if the killer knew Beth, if it wasn't random. One could argue that the killer was not going to mail evidence to the police that held his own name and information. I neglected to add a very important fact that before the letter arrived, the parcel arrived, the killer called in and described the details of Beth's killing and gave details only the real killer would know. And the killer told the caller that he would turn himself in, but he wanted to watch the police chase him for a few days. Then, after that call, which no one was able to determine who it was, that's when the articles arrived. Sorry, that was a very important thing to add, but Lord. In the first parcel that was sent, there were quite a few pictures of Beth with random servicemen. And so, again, the thinking is that the killer, if he had been one of those men, he probably wouldn't have included that picture of himself with the victim and mailed it to the police or to the press. Regardless, the men in the address book were sought. The men in the pictures were sought out. Everybody had to be interviewed and interrogated and have an alibi and prove that they didn't have anything to do with her murder. First to be questioned from the long list of men and women whose names were in the little brown book was Mark Hansen, whose name was stamped on the cover. He was eliminated after asserting that he had not seen the girl since last November. Not too sure about that. Says Hansen, a wealthy middle-aged theater owner, he was the part owner of the Florentine Gardens, said he supposed that Miss Short took the notebook from his desk when she and other Hollywood hopefuls, including Ann Toth, rented rooms in his home at 6024 Carlos Avenue. But this video is just basically about the evidence and not getting too much into the different suspects. That will be for another video. They queried sometime roommate Ann Toth about how they thought Beth met the 75 men in the address book. And she said, "Well, I never went out with her," Ann answered. "But she was a decent girl around the house. She never made a play for the other girls as boyfriends when she answered the phone or the door." Were they able to entertain men in the house? This would be Mark Hansen's house. And she said, "Oh, no, honey. This is a nice place. We don't let any men inside. We couldn't have men here. Give 'em an inch, they'll take a mile." This little snippet just notes that the page was missing from the address book and that the detectives believed that the missing page may have contained the name of the maniac who hacked her up in a frenzy of excitement. And they also note that there was a set of fingerprints found on the envelope. So just like they did for the body identification with Beth's fingerprints, and just like they did with the bristle brush, the LAPD touched the FBI for help, asked them for help to see if they had these fingerprints on file. Well, first to look and see how many fingerprints they could determine were on the envelope. The following reports were released by the FBI under the Freedom of Information Act regarding the Black Dahlia case, and you can see that the LAPD requested help. They thought they had 3 photographs of latent impressions from the envelope, and it says here, reference is made of your letter of January 31st, submitting 3 photographs of latent impressions, but voila, you're advised that the 4 latent fingerprints in the photographs were searched through the single fingerprint file. No identifications were affected, but there was yet another fingerprint that the LAPD had missed. So know that there are 4 latent impressions on file. They used to be on file with the LAPD. I would assume they're someplace digitally on file with the FBI. So maybe one day they can match these fingerprints. The FBI did say that they would retain the fingerprints for future comparison. And now the killer starts with the taunting letters. One original note said that the killer would give himself up at 10 a.m. on January 29th and turn himself in, but then, a new note would arrive saying, "I've changed my mind about surrendering. I'm afraid I won't get a fair deal." Again, these letters formed into words were cut from newspaper articles hiding the killer's true handwriting, or it was a hoax. So, everybody likes to get in on the action. So many people also admitted to being the killer that absolutely weren't the killer. They weren't even in the same state. So the killer and all the hoaxes, they were just continually taunting the police and the press with letters. This stuff is very reminiscent of the Zodiac Killer or a Jack the Ripper. So this was printed on January 28th in the paper, how Captain Donahoe was offering to meet the killer anywhere at any time if he wanted to give himself up, and that the police thought that whoever made the offer to surrender on a mocking postcard, that it might really have been the killer. And they believed that the slayer apparently craved the notoriety of his crime and that they might come forward. But they'd received 5 communications regarding the crime. And, the first one, they knew that was real. That was totally the killer because it contained Elizabeth Short's effects. And then they also believed that the follow-up postcard was also valid. It's confusing because the original note that came in with Dahlia's belongings, with Beth's belongings, was made out of these pasted letters from newspapers to form sentences, seemingly to hide the killer's handwriting. And then this comes in to the LA Examiner. Here it is, turning in Wednesday, had fun at police, back Black Dahlia Avenger. And it's like, now why is the killer writing in his own handwriting? It's very strange. It's kind of suspicious. And not to get you too sidetracked, but there are some similar murders to this Black Dahlia killing that involves women that were tormented and killed and tortured. And the handwriting in those cases is kind of similar to this one. So just keep that in mind. So just to sum up the evidence, the actual evidence, and not any kind of theories, we know that this is valid because on January 23rd, the Examiner had received a call from a man claiming to be the killer, and he said he was upset about the way the story was being portrayed in the paper, and he said he was going to mail in her effects to prove that he did it, and that's what he mailed in, what you see on the screen. So we know this is actually truly a part of the case. They also believe the next document that was mailed was also a part of the case. But after a while, you don't know if it's hoaxes or if it was the actual killer. On January 25th, 1947, Robert Hyman, a cafe manager, noticed odd trash in a can in front of his cafe located 2 miles from the Dahlia dump site. He saw a pair of pumps and a black plastic handbag, so he called the find into the police. But before the possible evidence could be collected, it went to the dump. So the police then went to the dump at 1819 East 25th Street to dig through the trash. And then they presented said trash to one of the suspects, Red Manley, the guy that was the last person that saw her when he dropped Beth off at the Biltmore. So let's observe this picture of Red Manley looking at the possible evidence spread out on a table, no gloves on his hand, and smoking a cigarette while he does so. Again, this is the 1940s for you. We're going to handle evidence with our hands even while smoking a cigarette. Touch DNA, who are you? We don't know you yet. So while Red Manley is perusing the selection of shoes and purses and accoutrements from the dump, he declares, yes, this is hers. It has a double heel cap, and I remember she asked me to take her to a San Diego shoe repair shop to have extra caps put on. So that's the way he allegedly identified Elizabeth's shoe. Here's another picture of the encounter, and you can see that there are small white arrows pointing to the purse and to the shoe that he identified. Here's a better picture of both the purse and the shoe. Well, covered from ash in the dump. Think everybody smoked back then, so there was ashes all over everything in the trash. We will discuss Red Manley as a possible suspect, but I just want to add here that he was given sodium pentothal to verify his statement, and also on 2 different occasions he was given lie detector tests. And while one could argue that the shoe and the purse that Red identified could possibly not be Beth's, maybe he just thought they were, one thing you can't argue with is that Beth had a trunk with her treasured possessions, and the trunk had been checked in at the Los Angeles Union Station, that's the Greyhound bus station, and had been in storage since November. The trunk was a treasure trove of pictures and letters telling of the typical Hollywood experience. And when the police found 2 candle stumps in the trunk. They were confused about what these little candle stumps were until her friend told of how poor Beth was using the candle wax to fill in the top of her cavities. So what was in the trunk? Correspondence, things that she felt sentimental about, her love letters with her former fiance, tons and tons of pictures of her with servicemen, which then led the police on more goose chases because they wanted to know who knew her, who would have a reason to kill her. Also, some clothing. This article notes that something of Beth's life was told in the letters that the police found tucked away in her luggage. These were love letters, neatly tied in ribbon, and revealing a story of men, heartbreak, more men, and more heartbreak. And a sense of guilt which plagued Beth's unfaithful heart revealed itself in letters which she wrote but never mailed. Desperation was their keynote. They revealed her as a beautiful, passionate girl, desperate for love and for protection. And I also want to note, you don't see in these letters a lot about, going on castings and I can't make it here and all this stuff. It's about love and marriage. That seems to be what she wanted out of life. On the 22nd of January, there was an inquest held in L.A., and the mother, Miss Phoebe Short, she testified to the identification of her daughter, the victim, and Lieutenant Haskins testified to finding the body. Robert Manley, that's Red, he testified to bringing Beth from San Diego to Los Angeles, leaving her at the Biltmore at approximately 6:30 p.m. on January 9th. Detective Hansen testified to the progress of the investigation, and Dr. Newbar testified as to the cause of death. The coroner's jury verdict was that of homicide by an unknown person or persons, recommending every effort be made to apprehend the perpetrators. And as of the date of the 22nd of January, they noted that they'd received hundreds of telephone calls and letters offering information and possible solutions, all of which were being checked out as they were received. And I gotta tell you, this case is crazy. The next section is going to deal with the suspects, and there are so many you could just throw a rock and hit one. Hit one or somebody claiming to be the suspect that had no interest, business, or knowledge of the crime. At this point, while filtering through the suspects, the police were focusing on a hunt for this torture chamber, this place where the savagery went down, because it wouldn't have gone down in a car or in that lot or someplace where screams could be heard. So shocked by the details of this crime, the city officials offered a $10,000 reward, which was a lot of money at that time, for the capture of the slayer. Sifting through these suspects, they're really focusing on this horror room. They said, we think that somewhere in some shack, be someplace with running water, the fiend who killed this girl tied her up, tortured, and finally strangled her. And that's what Detective Lieutenant Harry Hansen said. And again, they noted the absence of much of the blood, almost all the blood at the scene, made it obvious that the slaying took place elsewhere. Donahoe was also convinced that the murder occurred in some permanent place of abode rather than in a hotel, a rooming house, or an auto court. So what are the actual facts and evidence in this case? Well, everything having to do with the body. And then secondly, the things that were mailed in by the killer. The killer was in Los Angeles, mailing in her effects. He used something to disguise his handwriting, but might have left his own fingerprints on the envelope. We have the bristles from a cheap brush that were used to clean the body, and the bristles were left in some of the wounds, so we know that. We know that the trunk, later retrieved from the Greyhound station, were actually Beth's effects, and that the trunk may not have been accessed or known by the killer. Evidence could have been in that trunk. In addition, the shoe and the purse may or may not have been Beth's, but they could have been. They were identified by Red Manley. The next part of the series will focus on the suspects and who the LAPD and or the FBI were able to rule out and who they were not able to rule out. So if you like this video, please push the like button and hit that subscribe bell to be notified of the next upload. And without further ado, have an excellent day. Bye.